Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. This is our second AES Ireland section online event, guest speaker event, and we're very lucky and delighted to have Dr. Gareth Young as our speaker this evening. Gareth hails from Wales, and we've adopted him in Ireland for many years now. Dr. Young is a postdoctoral research fellow on the vSense project at Trinity College Dublin. Before that, he was a postdoctoral researcher working on the Building City Dashboards project at the National Centre for Geocomputing or Geocomputation at Maynooth University. Dr. Young's current research focuses on evaluating creative uses for cross-reality (XR) technology through both quantitative and qualitative means as per the principles of human-computer interaction. Part of his work involves the design and use and practice of cross-reality technologies in creative disciplines with a particular emphasis on the interface between users and technological platforms. Gareth's role within vSense is to observe and record how users interact with XR and to design new methods that allow users to interact with cross-reality in innovative and novel ways. And we were just talking there about Gareth's PhD work many years ago, and he has some fine examples there in terms of new haptic instruments that I'm sure he'll entertain us with those at some point during his talk. So welcome, Gareth. Thank you very much for giving your time this evening. And once again, welcome to everybody from around the world joining us this evening.
Again, thank you for the lovely introduction there. And thanks to everybody for tuning in today. I'm going to talk about my work, Haptics in Music, with the added subtitle, Exploring the Potential of Audio-Tactile Vibrations in Experiences of Cross-Reality Media, which is a bit dense, I acknowledge, but I hope that we can each take something away from the presentation today to discuss either in the session afterwards, or to feel free to get in touch over social media, or perhaps, heaven forbids, we should be able to meet in person sometime in the future. I really look forward to it. So what I'm going to try and do today is to give you all a brief overview of the work I do with vSense and position it in a music and audio engineering context. And this is going to involve unpacking the title content a little bit further and exploring how audio can be used to create haptic feedback, or more specifically, audio-tactile feedback for interactive musical content. And this is going to touch upon some of the definitions of the terminology that we're using here, like XR, haptics, and I'm going to give specific examples of how tactile feedback itself can be used to create an improved digital and virtual musical instrument for use in practice. So to begin with, I'm just going to introduce you to the vSense project at Trinity College Dublin. And as the title suggests, vSense focuses on the study of visual computing, and it was set up by Professor Alyosha Smolik with funding from the Science Foundation Ireland to broadly investigate creative technologies, which is one of the strategic research themes of the college here. The main areas of interest to the project are 6 degrees of freedom technologies like augmented and virtual reality, 3 degrees of freedom technologies like 360 video, light field imaging, which uses special cameras to capture information about the light field emanating from a visual scene, visual effects and animation using different techniques and tools to create effects with live action footage, and deep learning as well for visual computing, which aims to provide machine learning tools for creating a hierarchy of features from visual data. Now, as a human-computer interaction researcher, I find myself working within each of these areas to provide support for things like experiment design and formulating research around user studies. I also work directly on more creative experiments that focus on the use of volumetric video, cross-reality technology like mixed reality Ulysses, virtual field trips, games user research, using VR for empathy building, using VR in education, and of particular interest, I think, to the AES group is the use of volumetric video and cross-reality technology to make music videos. And that's what I'm going to try and talk a bit more about today. So focusing in a little bit on the term cross-reality, or XR. XR can be scientifically defined as the union between ubiquitous sensors, actuator networks, and shared online virtual worlds. And this definition goes some way to try and explain what the technology is and what it can do. But what we should really take away from this definition is that the X, as it is there, it represents a variable for us. So we can substitute the X with an appropriate technology that serves to blend the physical world with the digital world, and vice versa as well. So technologies like AR and VR are growing in popularity, and many more people are becoming more and more exposed to the mediums as a collective XR technology collective. You know, it's all just XR to us, but we're becoming more familiar with it. And it's also important to acknowledge that some of the philosophies behind the technology have been around for a really long time, and that forms of mixed reality themselves can extend beyond into other mediums, such as the mixed realities that we get when we read literature or we experience a television show. But still, the technology marches on, and the development of XR serves to progress multiple research avenues, such as music that we're and audio that we're all interested in here today. And when we apply this medium, the X of our equation, we're looking to mix technology, mix the physical world with the digital world with technology. And this has, for many years, been referred to along this reality-virtuality continuum, where we can explore the continuous connection between the physical world and the digital. And in a musical context, it means that we can take physical reality as we perceive it and augment it with digital content, or bring the physical world around us into the digital world in our PC or whatever platform we're using. Now, this is a bit crude, like many of the visuals that I'm going to use today. They're going to be a bit crude, but they're just there to sort of verbalize and get the message across, where we take this extreme of the continuum, the physical world, with a musician busking on the streets of Dublin, and a digital representation on the other side, using a concert drum, digital concert drum, in a virtual learning environment. And on the side of reality, we can bring our digital drum closer to the physical world by using some form of augmented reality technology, where I might take out my cell phone, hold it up to the world, and capture the actual events that are happening around me, and place a digital drum on my phone next to the musician, and maybe I can tap along and play with the musician in the real world. Like I say, crude examples. And in the opposite end of that spectrum, using virtual reality technology, we might be able to bring the musician into the virtual world, and I can then immerse myself in a digital environment, and I can interact with both the digital object and the real world musician as well. So this is all a continuum that serves to mix realities together, and it's mediated with cross-reality technology. So just to give you some further context, here's some of the cultural heritage work that we do at vSense, and it focuses on both augmented and virtual reality, and specifically the application of 6-DoF XR technology and a technique called volumetric video. So AR head-mounted displays, or HMDs, they use cameras across the front of them and transparent screens to spatially map the environment around you, and it can anchor digital objects into the real world. And AR can come in the form of tablets as well, and cell phones, and you might be more familiar with them with Pokemon Go and the likes, becoming an IKEA using them in the home. And these provide a window on the world that facilitates similar functions, but just using different technologies. VR, on the other hand, brings the user into the virtual world, providing immersion and interaction via the HMD device. And if I had to choose a favorite child, it would definitely be VR at this stage. Much of that decision is to do with gaming and the use of imaginative worlds that you can just buy them now. They're on the shelf. You can just take them down and use them from Steam and the likes. And so I've also included here one of my favorite definitions of virtual reality from a guy called Jaron Lanier. You may have ever heard of this guy before. And he says one of his many definitions, I might add, a 21st century art form that will weave together the three great 20th century arts: cinema, jazz, and programming. And I find that personally quite motivating, as it acknowledges the works that were done in the last century that provide the strong foundations for the work that we do today. And just a little bit more on some of the terms I used there. So, for example, 6 degrees of freedom. It means that I can, using this technology, not only control my point of view as, and I often get this wrong, pitch, yaw, and roll, but I can also move backwards and forwards and side to side in these, using these HMDs, which means that it's basically an AR or VR device that sits on your head. You don't use your hands, you just put on the glasses and they work as they do. So here's both AR and VR via HMDs next to each other. And they can be used quite successful when combined with imaginative content, such as our Dean Jonathan Swift here. He's a volumetric video character, and he is in the long room at the TCD library there. And for the AR, the user visits the site, they put on their HMD as they would, say, an audio tour, and they explore the physical location with different characters, introducing themselves along the way throughout the different real-world exhibitions, be they the Book of Kells or the Long Room Library, etc. On the other hand, VR presents the same digital content, but the user is instead transported from their home or wherever they're using the VR, taking a virtual field trip to a distant location in the real world, or even somewhere a bit more imaginative, like you could go off into space or anywhere you like a far off distant desert island. So each of these technologies have their strengths and weaknesses, but I still prefer VR. And if anyone's interested in experiencing either technology, or they're interested in these types of works, you can just drop me an email, and if COVID allows it, you can come over to the lab, and I don't mind giving you a first-hand demonstration myself, or we can arrange someone to do it for you. It'll be nice to see you all in real life. So the technique of using volumetric videos has been seen in music before, and in much larger projects with much larger budgets. So to present the creative musical content of different artists, some notable examples are Billy Corgan's Aeronaut, Tino Kamal's VIP, which were both filmed in big BV capture studios with over 60 cameras, with large project teams. And did I mention the budgets? Right, there's like serious coin in this to just get a couple of minutes of volumetric video. It's really expensive. There's also the virtual reality works of Bjork, which goes one step further and places the viewer into the immersive virtual environment and provides some interactive features as well that immerses the audiences further within the music video materials. But other equally handsome musicians, you can see, can also use VV to create some interesting 3D content of their own, but with much lower, more realistic budgets. Read academic budgets there, if you like. So the work we do at vSense is exploring the potential to create VV content with only 12 cameras to produce imaginative and interactive musical content that immerses the audience alongside the musician. And this involves a small green screen tent that has 12 cameras surrounding the performance space. And I can tell you, as a 6'3" guy, that it's a bit tight in there, but you do get some interesting content to play with. It presents interesting approaches to the genre of music videos and XR technology in and of itself, but we can expand this further and take it much more in a different direction from traditional interactions with musical content, using something called haptics, or more specifically in my research interest, audio-tactile feedback, which I will dive into in much more detail later. But just to wrap up the idea of XR music, it's this idea that we can take XR and volumetric video and we can provide a platform for immersive experiences of music. They can be multimodal, they can be stimulating in an auditory, visual, and tactile sense. They can be interactive and explorable with 6-stop technologies. And audiences can potentially get closer to and have a qualitatively different experience of music-focused materials. So, for example, in this brief short here, I put together a short concept scene that allows the user to engage with free and open source content to create their own imaginative, immersive, and interactive scenes. So we can transport our users off to far off locations in the middle of the sea, where they can awake from their dreams and freely explore a distant sandy island. But the additional interactive element here is that there's a big concert drum that they can interact with, that we can play with the physics here. So we can add odd physics behavior that we perhaps couldn't do in the real world, like suspending gravity for drumsticks, which is a bit weird. You wouldn't do that in the real world. But you can also play the drum as loud as you like and for as long as you like until your heart's content. That's the concept anyway. So with the XR music scene set, I want to explore some of the science behind how we can allow audiences and musicians to feel the music, not only in an emotive sense, but in a physical sense as well. And also touch upon how we can go about evaluating such devices in practice. So there's a lot of text there, but haptics in and of itself is an old school term for a technology that's been around for a really long time. And with the huge leaps that have been made in the audio and visual side of XR, I believe that haptics is next in line for a little technological bump. So terms like tactile and force feedback that are types of haptic feedback that can be seen and heard about today will be likely to gain more momentum in the coming years, in my opinion. But there are other factors at work here, like kinesthetic and proprioceptive feedback and the differences between them. And this gets in the way when I start hearing about haptics. It's like, what do you mean by haptic? What term for haptic are you using here? Because haptic is used as a blanket format to describe all of the above. So if you're exploring the use of haptics in your own work, you should look for clarification in the terms that are being used and just be aware of the breadth, width, and depth of the established field that you're entering into. Just a forewarning there. So haptics for me relates to this combined sense of touch that comes from and in the form of both tactile and force feedback together. And music is a great way for us to explore this and to demonstrate haptics. We can turn to interactions with musical instruments. And I've oversimplified an interaction with a musical instrument in this slide, just for illustrative purposes. Like I say, brute force to get my point across is the way of it. But to begin with, I try and focus on 3 main points: the user, the instrument, and the feedback loop that's created between the user and the instrument. And I use the term I use the term user here to broadly represent musicians, mainly because not everybody who picks up an instrument is a musician. Pure and simple, there's some musicians out there that when they interact with musical instruments, they're still undertaking 2 tasks, whether or not they're a trained musician or not. And what I see is they are formulating an intention, and they are physically embodying an interaction. And that depends on the instrument, and that depends on the form of the interface that's there, such as plucking, beating, or strumming. So my example is the guitar. We have our guitar training, and we recognize what we can do to make a chord or to make a plucking or knocking sound. We either innately know or we're trained to know. And with the instrument, there's a gestural interface involved, and there's a sound generator involved, and that they are combined in this case. With the guitar, The gestural interface is the string, and the sound resonator is the string in the body. But for the sake of simplification and reasoning, we'll just say that they're two separate things, because when we look at digital and virtual instruments, those two things are separate, that they're two things. And what we get when we create sound with our interface, there's a transfer of data from the gestural interface to the sound generator, USB, Wi-Fi, OSC, MIDI, or whatever, passing information between the two parts. And what we get from these interactions is some sort of feedback. And for music, the most prominent feedback we get is the sound the instrument makes, followed by a visual confirmation that my hand is moved and the instrument interaction is over. And somewhat to a lesser degree, we also get a confirmation of a successful interaction via our proprioceptive feedback. Our body tells us that we've done something, and haptic feedback is there as well, as we described earlier. So when I said about the weirdness that comes from digital musical instruments, so we have virtual musical instruments in that group too. We can deconstruct and reconstruct this flow of interaction in different ways. And when I interact with this device, it makes no sound at all until I plug it into the sound generator. And what this allows me to do is to play with the device separately. And I don't have to put a lot of time into deconstructing and reconstructing the instrument. And I can have a heightened control over the individual musical instrument interaction elements. But what we often see is an oversight in this feedback loop. We see a lack of haptic feedback generally, and remembering the broadness of the term haptic, which is fascinating for me. And I tried to understand that a bit more by taking things apart and putting them back together and playing with them. And there are a lot of different techniques, but they all serve to do one thing, and that is to stimulate the body. And that's usually done through the skin. It's usually soft, it's usually flexible, and it should cover our entire body. And it serves in protecting us, it regulates numerous functions, and it's the starting point for many of our different sensations. And these sensations come from a variety of nerve endings that are capturing the immediate world around us, and they relate to things like temperature. They look at if we're being hurt in some way, if there's someone or something touching us via pressure on the skin, and vibration. And with sound engineering in mind, remembering the audience, the last two sensations really grab my attention the most. And I have endeavored to create multiple devices in my life that communicate sound as sound and pressure, as tactile skin stimulation, and to try and record the effects of this. And one of the first examples, and the most prolific of mine, is the audio-tactile glove. And although I've created lots of different devices, I always come back to this one as it provided the building blocks for audio-related tactile feedback, especially ones involving digital music and instruments. So to create your own devices, you can readily get hold of these things. They are, I don't know if you can see that, they are tiny little actuators, and they're similar to what you find on the back of a loudspeaker, basically, but smaller. And they have a lot of the attributes that you see in speaker design as well. So they have impedance, power handling, frequency ranges, etc. And you can build those into your devices, and you can learn a bit about tactile feedback and what it can tell us about haptics in music. With the audio-tactile glove by itself, without any sound involved, I've started mapping out things like frequency responses for simple and complex waveforms that are, for all intents and purposes, the building blocks of many interesting timbres in traditional and alternative musical instruments. And what I found is that when building custom devices and integrating haptics together, it's really important that you don't get in the way of your interface. So you'll notice that the tips of the fingers are missing on the gloves. That's because when I'm trying to interface with a device, I'm usually using my hands. Now in virtual musical instruments, that might be different because there's nothing there. But then we look at other problems such as the forces being applied and crushing a virtual musical instrument. But this is what I found is that we have a frequency range, we have a frequency response that varies with amplitude, and they make some interesting shapes in terms of ranges and amplitudes for the different waveforms and their complexities. That they kind of look to me like equal loudness contours, and I kind of run with that as a metaphor. That although it's over a much shorter bandwidth and we're measuring different things, we can see things that kind of relate to the shapes of the equal loudness contours, the ISO definitions, etc. And what we can do with, which is really cool, I think, is that we can also tell the difference between these waveforms when we present them one after another with a relatively high success rate at certain frequencies. So we can tell the difference between a sine wave, a saw wave, or a square wave using just our hands about 88 to 86% of the time, which is kind of what you see in the unbiased, the probability correct measure there. You can look over the paper if you want, but I promise you that's what I found. But it's also important to acknowledge that at this point that we don't listen to music with our skin. We don't compose music for skin on purpose, usually. There are exceptions. There are a lot of exceptions to a lot of what I'm saying. This is why we have ears, right? We're making music. It's a multimodal experience, and we should always be aware of this when we are performing reductive exercises like measuring amplitudes and wave shapes and differences. So the next sort of measures that go on are these combined experiments where we look at the psychophysiological responses using the ears and the hands combined. And what I found is that you can improve the just noticeable differences for the same waveform and frequency as before, but only for sine waves. So your fundamentals there. The more complex the waveform, there's only a minor improvement in the observable JNDs that you can tell the difference between the frequency that is being applied to your hand and your ear with haptic audio-tactile feedback, which is the curve that happens under the graph there. I'll just try and summarize that quickly. So we can perceive tactile vibrations with the hands at different amplitudes and different waveforms. We can tell the difference between them, and we can accurately perceive subtle differences in just notable differences between a central frequency of 160 hertz in this case, when we combine them for sine waves, which is interesting when we think about digital and virtual musical devices. But what's also interesting is how we can measure that in terms of a musical practice. How do you take something as subjective as music and remove music from it? It's a pretty tough endeavor. We see it all the time, but I think that when you break it down, it's when you design and create custom-made novel instruments, you really have to think hard about how you evaluate them. And in my work, I look at evaluating three types of analysis: functionality, usability, and the user's experience. And I perform these analyses using different contexts then. And I'm going to go through three cases there very quickly now that I use to resolve this haptic versus non-haptic design. So the first one that we see a lot of are these functionality papers where we review the functionality of a digital device or a virtual musical instrument, and we sort of map out what the device does and how it does it. And I think there's value in this type of reporting, and it's very important that we know the ins and outs of a DMI, but they can also tend to be lacking in a musical or a musicality sense, and they don't really provide any insights into how instruments for musical interactions behave in performance practice. So this is where I try and use HCI a little bit, and in one particular study, I tried Fitts law, and Fitts law is used to show how the time required to rapidly move to a target area is a function of the ratio between the distance of the target and the width of the target. Well, in music, that can be imaginatively mapped to things like musical exercises, like the time it takes to move from one pitch function to another, and the target size. So if I go over the fret there, the pitch space moves, and it's a different note then. With a different instrument, that can be imaginatively unpacked. And when looking at this under a microscope with regards to haptic devices, there is a marked increase in things like move time, an objective measure of how fast you can move from one note to the next. It's not musical, but it is music and sound related. And we can see a marked improvement for, in terms of the, I don't know if my pointer is coming up here. What we can do is we can see under the curve here, the move time decreases the more haptic feedback you get. And when you try and measure that with an objective usability matrix, you get something like great usability for haptic devices, but not for non-haptic devices. But if you want to know why, that's a little bit more of a difficult question. And I often look to qualitative user experience questions to answer those sort of whys. I think that they provide a richer depth of knowledge. They also take a lot longer to unpack and report upon. And in this, it's just a content analysis matched with critical instance technique. And we look at things like the positive comments that are made, the critical areas of interest in the musician, and watch as more negative things come up as we move through the different types of feedback. The third example is in actual music, recognizably musical exercises. Haptic versus non-haptic devices are presenting with experiential differences that impact upon the overall creative practice of making music. And they can be reviewed using lots of different techniques as well. So we can see things like system usability scales, SEQs, SMEQs, UEQs, TLXs, and all of the acronyms that you like. They show a marked improvement in musicians' experiences with digital devices when you include haptics. And again, this describes the phenomenon in musical practice, but it is kind of subjective, the way in which they're evaluated in terms of the qualitative feedback, because getting the data and getting lots of musicians to play with them is actually quite difficult to do. So on a somewhat open ending there, I will wrap up, and we'll have a discussion hopefully about how we qualitatively experience music and creative practice in both the real world and the digital. Maybe we can talk about how we experience music with and without the body, to find out more about why musicians sometimes prefer one musical instrument paradigm over another. Is that the look of it, the sound of it, or the feel of it, or is it all of the above? Is there more questions to be asked about how we evaluate technology in creative practices because of how we interact with the digital world to maybe check our emails or hold virtual conferences? That isn't necessarily the same way as we interact with technology in creative practice. So is HCI not the correct tool to be applying here? Should we look for more bespoke or different ways to evaluate creative technology? Or is that just going to create an overflow of tailor-made evaluation practices, none of which have any validation or difficult to take meaning from in a repeated case-by-case study? And I'd also maybe like to think about this figure here, which is one of my favorite visuals that I use internally for evaluating XR in creative practice. And it's a really old one. It's from the 90s, just as teenage Gareth was. And it's what I use in my head when I'm in VR or AR and I'm using it creatively. I find myself thinking about how interactive an experience is, how immersive does it make me feel? Is it imaginative in the way that it's delivered? And is this a potential model for or approach that we might choose to take with virtual musical instruments moving on, or digital musical instruments? And yeah, thanks for sticking around and listen to me jabber on about stuff that I love, and I hope that we can have a discussion about some of these things, about haptics in music. And please visit my website for more details on the research that I've just described, and of course the vSense website, where you'll find more of my creative experiments that are currently in motion. So thank you.